a normal announcement as I normally do. Hi, everybody. I'm Hadar Harris, the Executive Director of the Center. Thank you all for coming today. Before we get started and before I introduce our moderator, I'm going to put my Executive Director hat on just for a second and thank the people who helped to put today's event together. Lauren Bartlett, who has been staffing the trenches. I want to not say manning, but staffing the trenches here at home. We've been doing a lot of this work on Swaziland and helped to put together today's event, as well as Michael Bainey, who's the center's program coordinator. We're happy to see you all here. We're even happier to say that we don't have any upcoming events for the rest of this semester because we want to give you all time to be able to study for finals for those of you who are doing that or who choose to do that. We advise it if you're a student here. And so we look forward to seeing you all after winter break, but you should stay tuned because our Student Advisory Board applications will become available online immediately after the close of finals. You have through the first couple of weeks of the semester to apply. We will be having an event, I think the first week or the second week when you get back, to inform you a little bit more about what the Center's Student Advisory Board does. But it's a great opportunity to work very closely with the center. Drew Barr is currently on our Student Advisory Board. Lauren Bartlett is on our Student Advisory Board way back at the beginning of when it was founded. The second one, I think, right? And so you can talk to them and others around the school to learn more about what the experience is. We're also happy to have some guests from outside the university here with us today. We're happy to have you here, and we look forward to a rich conversation. Any other announcements that anybody needs to make or wants to? Other than good luck with finals, happy Thanksgiving to all of you, and we're going to get our program underway. Our moderator today is Jamie Skaluba, who is the Swaziland country expert for Amnesty International USA, and we're very happy to have her moderating the panel today. Jamie, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me?
Push the button so the green lights up.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
Thank you so much for joining us at our Swazi Justice event today. In July of this year, Thulani, Maseko and Behki Makhubu were arrested or were sentenced to 2 years in prison. My colleagues to my right have just come back from a trip to Swaziland, and they're going to tell you all about it. I am honored and privileged to work with them as part of this coalition. To my very far right is Hadar Harris, Executive Director for the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law at the Washington College of Law. In this capacity, she is responsible for an annual program of approximately 50 events and conferences, a variety of grant-funded programs, and approximately 20 ongoing collaborative projects with students and NGOs around the world. Ms. Harris is an international human rights attorney and specializes in the issues of business and human rights, civil and political rights, gender equality, and domestic implementation of international norms. Next is Stephen Donaghy. He is our Swaziland expert who has lived and worked in the country for over 6 years, doing various work with NGOs and civil society governance projects. Next, we have Jenna Anderson, Senior Counsel for the Center of Human Rights at the American Bar Association. Prior to her work at the ABA, she was a human rights attorney with the International Community of Women Living with HIV, where she advocated for rights of women living with HIV and AIDS in global policy and practice. Before that, at the Center for Health and Gender Equality, she analyzed U.S. foreign policy and legislation in the context of women's rights. Jenna also clerked for the Honorable Thad Hartfield, U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Texas. And finally, to my immediate right is Jeffrey Smith, Program Officer for the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. Mr. Smith worked with RFK Partners for Human Rights and manages the RFK Center's partnership with the 2009 Human Rights Award laureates. Mr. Smith also works closely with the RFK Center laureates in Uganda and Chad and collaborates with human rights defenders across the African continent to promote and respect human rights, equality, increased civic space, rule of law, and good governance. Mr. Smith has over a decade of experience in human rights and democracy promotion work, including prior positions such as Freedom House and National Endowment for Democracy. Stephen, take it away.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon now, everybody. If I speak at this volume, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, I see people at the back nodding. I don't want to patronise you by assuming you know nothing or too much. So how many people know where Swaziland is or anything about Swaziland? Okay. There's a map behind me, I understand that bit. Well, okay, unusually for law, I'm going to start with geography. Okay, as Jamie said, I lived and worked in the country for 6 years doing democracy, human rights and various sorts of troublemaking. I never got arrested except by my own side when I created too much democracy within the democracy movement. Swaziland is a little tiny country, as you can see, and it's mountainous. And as the people, the Nguni people came down the east coast of Africa, they peeled off, and the Swazis found this mountainous kingdom. And in traditional and old-fashioned warfare, mountains are hard to attack and they're easy to defend. And so the Swazis became a little, they went in there and they became a little bit isolated. Politically, socially, it's a bit like the Galapagos Islands for biology. There was just a little island there where not a lot happened. The Zulus would come and attack every so often. There were wars. The Swazis tried to attack back down into KwaZulu-Natal. And it just became a peaceful thing that the Swazis would stay in their kingdom and the Zulus would leave them alone. That led to a very isolated society. It didn't trade very much. It didn't interact very much, and it survived. And its continuing mantra is survival. So even through the wars, when the British came in, when the Boers came in, the Swazis had a way of accommodating people without allowing them to change, without having to change themselves, and they managed to survive. Even through the ANC, through apartheid, King Sobhuza, the father of the nation, he was a card-carrying member of the ANC. And he supported the ANC doing work where they moved people and guns and munitions across the borders from Mozambique. But he also had to allow the South African Defence Force to come in and raid Swaziland to get the same comrades out. If he didn't do that, they would just take over. They would annex the country in a matter of seconds. So it's a place that knows how to survive using its wits and not using its might. And so the people are very canny. And if you know the movie, The Usual Suspects, the starting line of that is the greatest trick the devil ever pulled off was convincing the world he didn't exist. And Swaziland is expert at doing that. It's just going, we're not a problem, don't look at us, look over here, look over there. And if you look back at the recent history, say in the 1990s, you had apartheid in South Africa, you had the civil war in Mozambique, the two neighbours, 1 million people died in Mozambique. So Swaziland looked peaceful. But as those places get sorted out and the other big conflicts across Africa start to get sorted out, and the role of, the democracy starts to roll across the region, startingly and hesitatingly, and there's lots of problems with it. But Swaziland becomes like the island when the tide goes down, and people are starting to see that it is a problem. So within this isolated and inward-looking country, you have two systems of power. You have the traditional system, an old African system, where the king is the centre of everything. And the king is the centre of power, he's the centre of the economy, he's the centre of wisdom. He has a very important, and one that we as Westerners don't often understand, he has a quasi-religious role as well. And the king's powers, people will genuinely believe that the king would have the power to disappear, to be invisible to his enemies, to turn himself into a cat, and to bring curses upon you and your family. And if you don't understand the mystical aspect of the king's power, it's very difficult for us as Westerners to see how and why Swaziland works. This king's power, he doesn't just sit as an isolated figurehead. He then has a system of chiefs. In a country of only 1 million people, there's 350 odd chiefs, and they rule the rural areas, and they make sure that the traditions continue. And they control the access to land. They control the access to resources. They also solve disputes. And they solve disputes in a system of traditional justice, which is unwritten. And it's important to understand the nature of the oral history within Swaziland. Because you're all law students, and God, this is the first time I've been in a law class for 25 years. But everything is written down. the law is what's written, and then the culture and even the ways of interpreting the statutes that you do, everything is written down and it comes from that. But in an oral culture, it's different, and it was set up or it evolved in order to protect society, to protect a small agrarian society which had high levels of war, high levels of predation. And these things worked, but they worked not for the benefit of the individual, but for the benefit of the society. Now, moving quickly on, because we don't have a lot of time here today, the British ruled Swaziland as a protectorate, and then in 1968 they gave it independence, and they gave it a multi-party constitution with human rights, democracy, and all the things that we would recognise, and the symbols of democracy, a parliament, an independent judiciary. The first election took place, and there was only 24 seats in Parliament, and the King's Party, the Imbokodvo National Movement, won all 24 seats. So everything was happy. In the next election in 1972, 3 seats were won by the Ngwani National Liberation Congress. So 3 out of the 24 seats now went to the opposition, and the King, there was then a way for people to legitimately voice opposition, and the King didn't like that. And in common with the historical movement across Africa of moving from multi-party to one-party Marxist or no-party states, the political parties were banned, and a state of emergency was declared, where the King drew all power to himself. That went on. That continued right up until the late 90s, as I said, after apartheid was sorted out and the Mozambican war was sorted out. People then started to look at Swaziland and say, you can't continue with this, you have to change, and what you need is a constitution, a written constitution. And so they put in place, after 10 years of manipulating and working around a lot of fudges with the international community, they come up with a constitution which practically changed nothing. The constitution still allows the King to appoint 40% of the parliamentarians. It allows him to appoint all of the judges. He is still head of the executive. He appoints the cabinet. Not all cabinet members are elected from or come from the parliament. And he's head of police, army, and the correctional services. And he may not be sued in court, and he may not be questioned in any way. And that's within the constitution. And we have tried to take certain cases and challenge the King on this, and the judges are very clear we're not going to. You would have thought a constitution with a Bill of Rights actually gave people hope, and it gave them an opportunity to start to work with these rights and claim some space for themselves. But the people and the traditions and the society there, and we've done a lot of work on the ground doing civic education, they think in terms of permission, not rights. And so the idea of even the right to have a right is where you start with civic education. But in 2008, after the Constitution came about, there was a bomb went off just outside the King's Palace, and a terrorism law was put in place, and somebody was arrested for supporting terrorism, Mario Masugu, leader of the Podembo National Party. Under the Bill of Rights, under the Constitution, his case after a year was actually thrown out, and it was thrown. There was not even. The state said, the judge said there wasn't even a case to answer here. He didn't have to put up a defence, and that enraged the authorities. And they said, we can't be having this constitution. We can't be losing court cases. And so they put in. The post of Chief Justice was available, and they put in a Chief Justice who was willing and able to carry out their wishes. We've had at least 30 important constitutional cases, and the government has only lost one, and that is the right for women to own their own property. And even then, it was a long and detailed fight. So we have a Chief Justice in place now who is doing the will of the executive. He's gone further than that, and that he's now starting to not just say this is what we want in terms of a hearing, but these are the judges that we have, and he's appointing judges outside the Constitution. He is acting in a very, very hubristic and high-handed manner. And in doing that, our two friends, Thulani and Behki, criticised him in paper, and they were arrested. and that's where I want to hand over to Hadar. But I want you to take away the thing that it's an oral culture, that it's very much in terms of power and permission, and that rights are very, very nascent within society as a whole. Hadar.
Thanks. So, how do we gather here today? I think it's really important to understand the context of why this event is happening and how we came together. My job is to give you a little overview and context of this case. Stephen gave you a sense of where Swaziland is and exactly kind of the context of the country. Jeff is going to speak a little bit about some of the advocacy agenda, and Jinnah is going to speak about some of the legal strategies. But I come into this case from a very personal perspective. Thulani Maseko was a Humphrey student, a Humphrey Fellow here at WCL. He was an LLM student, and he sat in the seats where you sit today. I became aware that this case was happening, that he had been arrested, together with Behki Makhubu, the editor of The Nation magazine, only in May. They had been arrested much earlier than that. But as we looked at this case and got involved on behalf of our colleague and friend Thulani, we came into connection with the RFK Center for Justice and Human Rights, where Jeff Smith works, and the great advocacy that he had initiated and started with Jamie and the work that Amnesty International has been doing, as well as the ABA Center for Human Rights, where Jinnah works, and the ways in which they were helping to support the legal strategy. Starting in July, we had regular meetings to think about and talk about and strategize about what we would do. I want to tell you a little bit about that story and actually what happened to Thulani and Behki and what is happening now. Let me switch the PowerPoint. So it's important to note that there are kind of two pieces to this. There's an underlying case, and there is the specifics of Thulani and Behki's case. The story starts out because a government vehicle inspector named Banshana Gwebu was doing his job. His job was to ensure that government vehicles owned by the state, were being used only for state purposes, not for personal use. And on a Saturday, he found that the car of a judge named Esther Ota, a picture of her is there, was being used by her for personal uses. And he arrested the driver of that car outside of a school where the judge had been driven to buy some school supplies for her children. And the vehicle inspector, appropriately doing his job, slapped the driver with two charges, both that he was using a government vehicle for a purpose other than authorized without a written permission, and that he was allegedly using a government vehicle on a weekend, which wasn't permitted. So this government vehicle inspector had a little history, because not only had he arrested the driver of this judge's car, but in a previous incident, he'd actually arrested the driver of the Chief Justice's car. There's a lot that goes on here in this story of what happens to Thulani and Behki, and the Chief Justice plays a key role in all of this. So the government vehicle inspector was arrested, and there was quite an outcry within the country that he was arrested. This slide shows that reactions were pretty swift, and it was publicized in the newspaper that he had been arrested for doing his job. The reactions and response published in the newspaper were pretty out there for a country where there's not a lot of freedom of speech. One of the comments here, you can't read it well, but it says, "Poor Banshana, his arrest is ridiculous and disappointing. That's totalitarianism at its best." Another comment, "The Chief Justice is out of line. What contempt of court? Why was Judge Ota using a government car when buying her children's uniform? Ota, you were breaking the law, and you and the CJ, Chief Justice, are abusing your powers." That's pretty strong stuff. Within hours, if not days, the same newspaper printed a retraction
under tremendous pressure, which gives you a sense of where independent media in Swaziland stood at that point and still stands today. The retraction says in our January 23rd publication, we published contemptuous readers' comments from the web. Note that the government vehicle inspector was charged with contempt of court, that he had arrested the judge's driver, and by doing so, he was maligning the integrity and dignity of the court, and therefore was held in contempt. So here, they're very specific in their language, publishing a retraction saying, we published contemptuous readers' comments from the web. We wish to retract such comments, which cannot be repeated due to their very nature, and unreservedly apologize to the Honorable Chief Justice, as well as Her Ladyship Judge Ota and the entire judiciary. It's pretty big stuff. So the reactions were really swift, and so was the retraction. But shortly thereafter, after this retraction was printed, there were several articles that were published by Behki Makhubu, the editor of The Nation magazine, an independent media source that publishes a monthly magazine, and Thulani Maseko, our former student who's a prominent human rights defender in Swaziland. He's an attorney and takes on some pretty courageous cases in that country. And among the things that these articles said, they basically called out the Chief Justice and the King and the entire judiciary around the hypocrisy of arresting the government vehicle inspector for doing his job and charging that vehicle inspector with contempt of court. And what happened to them? They too were arrested, and they too were charged with contempt of court because they did not publish retractions, nor were they interested in publishing retractions. The circumstances around their arrest and the trial are complicated at best and irregular in the most diplomatic way of putting it. There's other words that we could use for it and have been used for it on Twitter and in other places. In a highly unusual move, the Chief Justice, Ramadibedi, is alleged to have personally issued the warrants for Thulani and Behki's arrest. As magistrates generally issue the warrants, the Chief Justice's involvement in the whole case was really so irregular that Judge Dlamini, who first saw the case, ruled that the Chief Justice was acting outside of his authority, and within a few days, the two, Behki and Thulani, were actually released from custody. Chief Justice didn't like that very much, and so he switched the judge. And another judge, 3 days later, issued new arrest warrants, locked these two men up again, and a trial was started under the auspices of Judge Simelane, who's perceived to be loyal to the Chief Justice. The trial started on April 22nd. They've been in prison since the middle of March. And there was a tremendous public outcry as these two men, a lawyer and a journalist who wrote an article, were brought into the courtroom in leg irons, something that we saw when we were there just a week and a half ago. The defense started by arguing that Judge Simelane, the presiding trial judge, should be recused as he'd subpoenaed the defense and was being called as a witness in the matter along with the Chief Justice. Everyone was involved in all of this. But Judge Simelane responded that he'd not been aware of the subpoena or the fact that he was being called as a witness, and so he ordered the matter to proceed to trial. The state presented its case. Several witnesses were called, including the Deputy Registrar of the Supreme Court, who was the primary witness for the prosecution. She contradicted herself numerous times in her testimony, particularly when she was unclear whether she commissioned the police affidavit before or after reading the allegedly contemptuous articles that were published in the newspaper. She couldn't remember. Really? Can I go a little longer just to lay it out, you think? Okay. So the trial continued. The defense appealed the recusal decision to the Supreme Court, but one of the Supreme Court judges, who happens to be a former law professor at Florida State University and is an associate, I'm going to say an associate member of the American Bar Association, who presides over Supreme Court cases in Swaziland twice a year and also worked as a judge in Guyana, where he's from, denied this request for recusal, saying it needed to be written appropriately and appropriately submitted so that the Supreme Court could hear it in the right time. The trial continued on May 19th with 100 people in the courtroom, heavy police presence in the courtroom, both uniformed and ununiformed, secret police and obvious police. At one point during the proceedings, there was a tank outside of the courthouse, which is hard to get to. In fact, you'll see a picture of kind of it sits on a hill, so it would be hard to get an armored vehicle up there, but they did. And there was a lot of intervention in the case. In fact, on June 4th, Thulani Maseko was trying to give his closing argument, which was highly critical of the court and of the proceedings. And after a few minutes, he was stopped by the judge on the assistance of the Chief Justice, who had sent a police officer into the court to deliver a message. The judge said that he was making statements that are inadmissible in court because in his statement he criticized the judiciary's handling of the case. The next day, in a surprise move, he was actually allowed to finish giving that defense statement. But in the meantime, in early June, there was a great deal of international outcry about this case. A letter signed by 49 prominent individuals and organizations from around the world, with the lead signatory being Desmond Tutu, a statement by a statement by a whole bunch of UN human rights experts condemning the proceedings. And finally, on July 25th, the two men were convicted and eventually sentenced. Actually, it was July 17th that they were convicted, July 25th that they were sentenced to 2 years in prison, an extraordinarily long sentence for a crime of contempt of court. There are lots of different pieces that we're going to talk about, but what you should know is the work of this group has been to develop a campaign that we call #SwaziJustice. You can see a great picture of us brainstorming what the hashtag of this campaign should be. One of the things that resulted from this campaign was the creation of a video with a variety of human rights experts and notable celebrities from around the world who have helped to raise the profile of this case internationally. I'd like to play that for you so that you can see it and hear the words that Thulani was actually prevented from speaking in that first attempt to give his defense statement. And then maybe at that point I'll hand it over to Jeff and to Jenna to talk more specifically about some of the more specifics of the advocacy work that we're doing. How's that? Okay. So hold on 1 second. Oh, great. I knew it was too good to be true that I was actually able to pull that up. On my slide.
All right, we're going to work out the sound, but why don't we go to Jeff for now while we figure it out, or Jenna, sorry.
All right, so Jenna Anderson, the ABA Center for Human Rights. The Center for Human Rights has a program called Justice Defenders. I'm the deputy director of that program. And our goal is to coordinate pro bono legal support to human rights advocates around the world who are facing legal retaliation or barriers for their work. So it's an emergency response mechanism, and it does not provide direct representation. We engage with local counsel and with local advocates to help them with their cases in local courts, to help them think through international legal strategies, and to make sure they're connecting with the bigger advocacy community. So in this case, one of the first things we focused on was, so there's basically a two-prong approach. The first is to ensure that where you have any kind of a chance of an independent court or an independent judge, you have supplied the lawyer with the best, most solid legal arguments, everything that court needs to arrive at a decision that complies with the rule of law and principles of justice. This is everything from criminal defamation cases, bans on NGOs that engage in political activities. There are a whole host of legal issues. At the end of the day, that's our goal, is to make sure that where there's a chance at an independent court, they have the legal arguments they need. The flip side is to recognize the role that international advocacy and pressure, especially political pressure, can put on systems where the independence or the impartiality has been compromised. And I think it's been pretty clear that that is what we're seeing in Swaziland. At the same time, you'll notice within the litany of pretty horrible miscarriages of justice, you will have an independent judge release so-and-so, an independent judge throughout the indictment. So you have these glimmers of hope. You have the judges who are trying. Most of them have faced some form of retaliation. There's a very big problem in Swaziland with independent judiciary, but they exist. And so if you do go to them, the hope is if you have these good legal arguments, your client actually does have a chance. And Thulani has been one of the lawyers who's been doing that for a very long time, successfully representing people, political opponents, and others, and getting people home to their families when they were being persecuted by the system. So that was our first approach. Let's get in touch with local lawyers and make sure that we're engaging with them on the legal strategies they need. So basically getting a whole bunch of pro bono lawyers in the UK and in the US to do research and turn it over to the local lawyers. Because when you're spending your day trying to figure out where your hearing is supposed to be in this completely inaccessible court, to come home and do all your research on, well, what is the UK law on contempt of court by publication? What do the US courts do with this same issue? Is a lot to ask. So our lawyers do that work, hand it over to the local lawyers, who then use it in their pleadings and in their oral arguments. So that was our early engagement, very direct contact with local lawyers and with the advocacy groups that were working with the local lawyers on what their arguments will be. In terms of the international advocacy, we turned to an American law firm. A lot of people are interested, but we have an American law firm right now who is actually working on a petition to the UN Working Group on arbitrary detention. Now, normally, we don't make that kind of thing public until it's been filed. However, in this case, the decision was made in Swaziland to make it public because even knowing that a big firm was working on the case was viewed as a way of putting pressure on the government. And so it is something that will be filed in the next few weeks, hopefully, and it will be timed with various decisions that are being made right now about the appeals process. So that's an example of the international mechanisms. For the law geeks, what's exciting about UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention is that you do not have to exhaust domestic remedies before going. And you also don't have to worry about states parties. It applies everywhere in the world. There's no treaty that gives you access or denies you access to this working group. So that was the international advocacy as well. The ABA issued a letter basically saying this case violates several principles of fair trial and rule of law. Arbitrary detention, freedom of expression, access to counsel was an issue early on. So that was the ABA joining in what was a pretty overwhelming wave of international public support for Thulani and Behki. In terms of the legal issues, I think, one, freedom of expression is pretty clearly implicated in this case. They made comments critical of the judiciary and were immediately put in prison. There is no form of speech that should be protected more carefully than that which is critical of government. And I think we can all agree to that and recognize that as a legal principle. Contempt of court by publication of statements twists that and actually lowers the standards of protection for criticism of the judiciary. And this is the reason it is no longer applied really anywhere in the Commonwealth. And actually in the UK, when they did a report finally formally getting rid of it as a doctrine, it hadn't been used since I think the 20s. It was an Irish case where it came up again. They actually had a report where they interviewed judge after judge, and the judges said, if we are allowed to put people in prison because they criticize us, we actually undermine our reputation for fairness. We do not augment it. So this doctrine hurts us. It doesn't help us. It only makes sense in a country where you are trying to regulate people's access to courts and where the courts are viewed as an extension of executive power and there's no balance or separation. This is exactly what the UK report said. It's exactly what Thulani has said, and it's exactly what his lawyers have argued. So that's the microcosm of the freedom of expression issue at stake. Arbitrary detention, I mean, they've been detained for many months. The length of sentence they've been given, 2 years for contempt of court, is ridiculous. I mean, that is beyond even the countries that still use it. It's very rarely more than 4 months, which future practitioners be grateful for, because contempt does still happen, not for publicizing criticisms of the court. But you can still be held in contempt by a court. You will never face 2 years in any country but Swaziland. So those were some of the early issues. While the case went forward, you know, we focused on working with the local council. Once they had the trial, once they had the convictions, they decided that they really wanted to up the ante for the judges and the independence and the judiciary, and to really highlight what is increasingly becoming a call for the international community, which is this is clearly a system that is not working. There is a very clear lack of independence. And that is highlighted when you have really good lawyers making really good legal arguments and they're getting nowhere. And in the Southern African region, that argument is particularly well made when you involve South African Council, which is something that has to do with the politics and the culture of the region. But the decision was made that having high-powered or fairly recognizable South African lawyers come in, join the defense team, not replace it, but join the defense team to argue before the appellate court on Thulani's behalf. And so that was something else the ABA was able to do through our Justice Defenders program.
Can you talk for a second about what happened? Because we forgot to...
At the appeal. Well, so the appeal, there's... Yeah, I mean, I would just say there's... The best way of understanding what did or did not happen at the appeal is to read one of the resources that was out front, the Mad Hatter's article. And so when we talk about the appeal, it was never an appeal of the actual conviction. It was an appeal of the lower court's decision to vacate the arrest warrants, the original arrest warrants, and find that basically this violated the process and the due process provisions of Swazi law, which that original order did not get to whether or not they could be held in contempt. So freedom of expression and those issues were never addressed, but just the procedural irregularities. So that was the purported appeal that was supposed to happen. And the lawyers were there and had filed heads of argument, and everybody was prepared to argue this. The idea being, well, if we can get them to uphold that decision vacating the original arrest warrants, that may be a way of getting them released. When they got there, my understanding, I was not one of the lucky few in the court, the appellate court said, well, why aren't you applying for bail today? I should have a bail application before me. Which, again, I'm hoping every law student knows, to file for bail for your client who is serving his sentence would make pretty much no sense. So it was not a failure on Thulani's or Behki's lawyers' parts. They had not filed a bail application with the appellate court. However, you have a duty to your client, and so when they were told this may be an opportunity, they proceeded to scramble and say, okay, well, maybe we'll just pretend this is the legal process that makes sense, and we'll try and do a bail application. Eventually, so it gets a little bit confusing at this point about, so they're being told to file bail applications, they're refusing to get to the substance of the appeal that was before them, which didn't address the conviction. Once the lawyers scrambled and filed something basically applying for bail, they were told, no, you can't do it here. You have to go back to the original judge, who was the judge who basically was put in simply to put them in prison. And the emotions are quite high at this point because you have two men who haven't really seen their families in months, not expecting to be released, told they may be released, told they'll probably be released, told you're not going to be released. And the entire time, the court is pretending this is a failure of the lawyers. And that is very frustrating to watch as a lawyer, as a friend of Thulani's, because this was not a failing of the lawyers. This was not a failing of Thulani or Behki. This was the appellate court basically creating a dual legal process. You know, by asking for a bail application, they were essentially pretending that those original arrest warrants, that procedure was still kind of in play, ignoring the fact they've since had a trial and been convicted. So I like to think of it as, by creating two legal processes for these men, they created two opportunities for themselves, double the opportunity to create procedural excuses and legal technicalities that are not actual legal technicalities, right, to make up legal technicalities to keep the men in prison. All the while doing it in a way that they can look around to the international community and say, we're following the rule of law. Nobody wants these men in jail. They didn't file a bail application. It makes no sense that they would have filed a bail application. So I do think this is where the overview that Jeff will give about where Swaziland sees itself in the international community is so important. They do want to be seen, the king wants to be seen as a country that is fully in line with Western values, in the sense that it is rule of law, he cares about his public perception. They're putting a lot of effort into pretending to have an independent judiciary when you cannot spend 5 minutes in a courtroom in Swaziland and not see that it's not. So it is a place where they care very much about public perception, which ties into why we're so happy to be a part of this group, this advocacy effort, and Swazi Justice. And then I'll turn it over to Jeff to talk about the rest of that effort.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenna, and to Jamie and Hadar and Stephen. It's any opportunity to talk about Swaziland, particularly human rights issues in Swaziland, is a great opportunity, I think. Because as Jenna sort of alluded to, Swaziland really is a microcosm of what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa right now, where for 8 consecutive years now we've seen a significant backsliding in terms of civil rights, namely judicial independence, freedom of expression, and freedom of assembly. And those rights are certainly under attack in Swaziland, and we saw that firsthand while we were there. But I also, before I go into the larger context of Swaziland, I also think it's important, we've been stressing this over and over again, but it's about two men. It's about Thulani. It's about Behki. Today marks 233 days that they've spent behind bars. If you do the math, that's 6,000 hours behind bars for essentially exercising their fundamental rights to free speech. But while it's about two men and their families, it's also about much more. We've heard a lot about this climate of fear in Swaziland. And on our delegation, everyone that we met with across the spectrum spoke in hushed tones. Every room we were in, they were looking behind their back to see who was watching, who was listening. At one point, actually a couple of points, people we're meeting with were looking under tables for recording devices. So as soon as you get into the country, it's a very different context. You feel it immediately. It's this very heavy, sort of pressurized feeling that you get as soon as you step off the plane. But as Jenna was saying, and others, authorities in Swaziland desperately wish to be seen as an enclave of traditional African values, that everything is okay. But once you start peeling back those layers, you start to see a completely different picture. Stephen touched on the 1973 state of emergency, which is in effect to this day. So for 4 decades, it's been in effect, which bans public protest, peaceful assembly. Political parties are banned under the state of emergency. And the new constitution, we heard a bit about that in 2006, makes no mention of the right to form political parties, despite people lauding the new constitution as this great new initiative. And it also does not weaken the absolute authority of the king. That still remains very much intact. Kingdom Swati also has the power to suspend constitutional rights, the freedom of expression and freedom of the press, unsurprisingly, which not only violates the Constitution, but also a wide range of international human rights standards and international law, many of which are conventions that Swaziland has signed on to and are ostensibly supposed to advance, to protect, and to promote. There's also no freedom of information law in Swaziland, one of the very few countries in sub-Saharan Africa that does not have a freedom of information law on the books. As you heard, he also has the power to appoint and remove judges, at a whim. So whenever he feels like it, he can do so. And Stephen brought up a very, really interesting anecdote that the current Chief Justice has only lost one case in the history of his tenure, which is absolutely remarkable on the outside looking in. But when you're there and you're in the courtroom and you see him and you make eye contact with him and you see the proceedings and the feeling, the suffocating feeling in the courtroom, it's not surprising at all. There's also a very highly restrictive media environment. The reason why these two men are behind bars. Recently, you may have heard a bit about Rwanda's current ruling despot, Paul Kagame, who banned the BBC for being critical of his government. Well, many people forget, in 2011, King Mswati was the first to actually do that when the Focus on Africa program aired criticism of the government, and he banned BBC broadcasts into the country. Many people point to hope in social media, Twitter, Facebook, activism, digital activism. But access to information is so hard in Swaziland. The prices of data are very, very high. Only 1 out of 4 people, just under 25% of the population, actually has access to the internet, which is woefully low. When you compare it to Uganda, for instance, which has, I believe, nearly 60 or 70% access to the internet. So hope is there. Hope there is looking a bit low as well. And there has been mounting criticism. It forced the king 2 years ago to announce a monarchical democracy in Swaziland, so sort of a melding of a monarchy and democracy, but it was just a name in name only. There's no substantive changes. Everything has remained the same. But you do see that he does care about his international image, and he is trying to put these misnomers out there. And just to give you a bit more of the context, some of you, in fact, all of you might be familiar with the Ibrahim Index of African Governance. On the participation in human rights category, Swaziland scores 46th out of 52 countries rated in that index. And on the participation subcategory, they rank 50th out of 52 countries in all of Africa. They only beat out Somalia and Eritrea. So that gives you an idea of how dire the situation is there, regardless of what you hear from the authorities and spewed in state media there. So the other important thing to realize is that this overall repression has coincided and is perhaps most likely due to a deep financial crisis. Let me explain. The dire political and civil liberties environment has very much contributed to this deep financial crisis. There's been a criminal maladministration of funds by the royal family, which spends very, very lavishly. King Mswati lives, to my mind, in brazen opulence, while a majority of his citizens live on less than $2 a day. And if you can imagine that, less than $2 a day buys you a loaf of bread, and maybe you can feed your children for that day. But it's really a day-to-day sort of thing. And because of this crisis has led to massive cuts in public services, including pensions, education, healthcare as well, and they've been steadily increasing over the past 5 years. And what's really worrying is this has led to a huge shortage of antiretroviral drugs, as well as HIV testing, which, if you know anything about Swaziland, is a huge problem because this is essentially a death sentence. Swaziland has the world's highest rate of HIV infection in the world. Between the ages of 15 and 49, 26%, 1 out of 4 people are infected with the disease. So just to give you some context, the average life expectancy in Swaziland is 46 years old, and the world average is 71. So one of the things we've been doing in addition to the Swazi Justice campaign is we've been working on some other initiatives to really tie Swaziland into this broader narrative of backsliding of human rights in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things we're working on, some of you may be familiar with the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which is up for renewal next year in the United States. And effective January 1st, Swaziland's AGOA status is going to be is effectively revoked due to their lack of commitment to workers' rights. They've been given every opportunity to uplift those standards, to meet those standards, and they've continually failed to do so. And just really quick, for those of you who don't know, AGOA is a long-term growth and development plan that was created by the Clinton administration in 2000, which provides duty-free access to America's market of $3 trillion worth of goods coming from Africa. And the 4 key issues we're going to push to strengthen AGOA standards are 4 key things. One is funding for civil society. So if the government actively restricts funding to civil society, they should not be eligible to receive AGOA status. Ethiopia is a good example. They've really set the bar in terms of restricting funding to local civil society. Secondly, freedom of association and assembly. As I run through these 4, you'll see Swaziland's not going to come close to reaching any of these. On the freedom of association bit, permission to hold public gatherings is frequently denied, and they often use, I think Stephen alluded to this, the 2008 Suppression of Terrorism Act, which essentially means the king can declare any semblance of criticism of any organization that voices criticism as a terrorist organization. And one of the interesting things we heard while we were there is that there's all these conspiracy theories going around that the Americans came in and drafted this law. So we can pretty much blame our own Patriot Act, not only in Swaziland but elsewhere, for these very, very repressive, wide-ranging so-called anti-terrorism laws that are used essentially to stifle civil society. Yeah, so while we were there, the hotel we were staying in, we were actually notified that we were terrorists. Some state security agents had come up to the proprietor of the hotel, asked why he was giving refuge to terrorists, meaning us. So we're now terrorists. So apparently a pen and a pencil and a Twitter account makes you a terrorist in Swaziland. So I'll wear that as a badge of courage from now on. The third issue is freedom of expression. As we know, publishing any semblance of criticism of the monarchy is criminal. Political pluralism is the 4th key issue we're going to push on. And as we know, political parties are banned in Swaziland. So in sum, Kingdom Swati's dictatorial regime, there's no other way to put it, in Swaziland is rightly getting the criticism it deserves, and we're really, at the vanguard of that, of trying to publicize what's happening there. And the king cares deeply, very, very deeply about his international image. And that's where you can come in, and that's where people listening can come in. That's where you can help. This is undoubtedly, to my mind, a turning point. This case has sparked international outcry, international attention to a point that Swaziland has never reached before. You see it being reported in international media. Journalists domestically are becoming more brave. They're coming out, speaking out against this, even some of those that we've met with in Swaziland, putting their own careers, their lives on the line to talk about this. So it's no excuse for us to stop and to stop pushing, and we definitely will do that. And, as a last point, the king and the authorities there, I think they can do this because they think no one's paying attention. But the fact that there's people in this room today, and the fact that there's people listening to the webcast today, is fundamental proof of the fact that people are paying attention. And that's, honestly, it sounds trite and it sounds a bit cheesy, but you really can make a difference by promoting this initiative, by getting out there and talking about these issues. And I think, meeting some of the youth in the country and talking to some of them in the diaspora, I think they can really make a difference. And just coming here today, I came across this really fantastic Mexican proverb, and it goes, they tried to bury us, they didn't know we were seeds. So I think that's where the hope lies. It's with the international community planting those seeds alongside our partners domestically, particularly the youth, and I think we can really make a profound positive change. So thank you very much.
Jamie, with your permission, I'll go back because I think what we've learned from working together is we're getting pretty good at finishing each other's sentences. That's what I see from this. I think that was pretty good. But I do want to, in the interest of giving you just a more personal look at what has happened, show you kind of the rest of the pictures and the slides from what happened on November 3rd. Jenna really beautifully summed up what happened in the courtroom. We have launched a number of advocacy initiatives in support of these two men and the legal principles that you've heard outlined. Among them, Thulani and Behki are prisoners of conscience as declared by Amnesty International. There is an urgent action alert that's available outside that we ask you to write letters on behalf of these two gentlemen, as well as is available on the Swazi Justice website. We've set up a Swazi Justice website, swazijustice.org, where you can find a bunch of information about this case. We've held screenings of the video that you will see soon, both in the lobby of the law school, at the Human Rights Film Series, at a variety of places around the world. And there's a very active Twitter campaign, hashtag Swazi Justice, led very ably by our Twitter guru, Jeffrey Smith, who's not tweeting at the moment, but is looking at all the tweets that are going out. As many of you know and participated in a note-writing campaign that I delivered to Thulani's wife, Tanele, and to Thulani himself. I could not give him the notes, but we collected about 100 notes of support for him, and I took photographs of them on my telephone. We were in court with Thulani on November 3rd for 10 hours while we were trying to figure out exactly what would happen in this petition for bail, because it kind of threw everything upside down. We had a long time to talk. We had a lot of interaction and ability to actually check in with each other. I showed him pictures of all of these various initiatives, and he was incredibly touched by these notes more than just about anything. He told Tanele, his wife, that he wants them framed and on the wall of his office for when he gets home and wants to see them there. She, of course, said, "How am I going to do that?" But having gotten to know Tanele, she absolutely will. A view from the courthouse, you can see it's on a hill, it's overlooking the mountains, and you get a sense of how difficult it would be to both access the courthouse and certainly to access it when it was closed off or when it was cut off, which it was in various periods of this trial. This was Thulani on November 3rd. As you can see, his friends stayed in close proximity with him, the guards from the jail, listening to everything he said. There were many people from the international community, not only Jeff, Stephen, and myself, as well as a variety of other people. Justice Johan Kriegler from the South African Constitutional Court, a retired justice who actually has written one of the most important decisions around contempt of court that one of the justices cited to from the bench. And we're not even sure if he knew that Justice Kriegler was sitting there, was there greeting Behki. Arnold Sunga from the International Commission of Jurists, with Beatrice Mtetwa, who was a political prisoner in Zimbabwe, a very, very well-known human rights attorney in Zimbabwe, with Jeffrey Smith. Tanele, Thulani's wife, Thuli Makama, a winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize, who's a very courageous human rights defender as well, and Justice Kriegler here at the bottom as well. A gratuitous picture of me and Thulani with Behki in the background. And then you get a sense of the court in session, the three justices, a surreptitious picture taken while court was in session. They didn't throw me out. They didn't see. And then, as Jinnah really well outlined, there was this real high and real low around the expectation or the belief that Thulani and Behki would be released from prison by Wednesday or Thursday of that week. We were called as we were about to leave to drive out of the country. And I was having breakfast. We were having breakfast with Tanele and Thuli, and Tanele and Thulani's 2-year-old son. And we were about to say our goodbyes and leave, and Thulani called from the courthouse. From the jail, from the prison, and said, "Meet me in court in 2 hours and bring me a suit." And we said, "But what's going on? We didn't think there was going to be hearing until tomorrow. How is it that we're coming together? What's going on?" Nobody knew anything other than we had to scramble and find a suit and bring it to the courthouse. Jeff made an in-kind contribution of his dress shirt, and we found a suit, and the baby even came to the courthouse. It's important to me. These pictures, I think, sum up so much. This was an opportunity for the baby to see his father, for Thulani to see the baby, and we really thought that he would be coming home that day, and that did not happen. Judge Ibrahim convened the court and chastised the attorneys and said that the papers for the petition for bail had been filed incorrectly, that he had done research over the last 2 days and found that, in fact, the Supreme Court could not grant bail, which they could, under Rule 22 of the Supreme Court Act. But indeed, that this had to go back to the trial judge, Judge Similani. At that point, Thulani said he would not apply for bail under a petition that would be brought to Judge Similani. And so at this point, where the case stands is at a bit of a standoff. We're now waiting for the full appeal of the case to be heard. There was a petition for that appeal to be heard in this session of the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court did not schedule it, allegedly because the transcript of the trial court proceedings had not been finished. They're being transcribed now, and clearly this is an effort to slow down the process. The Supreme Court will finish their current session on December 3rd. It's unreasonable to believe that any serious or legitimate appeal could be mounted between today and December 3rd, so that even if there is some off chance that the court would grant the hearing of appeal right now, it's really unreasonable to think that a legitimate appeal could be prepared in this period of time. But the court does have the opportunity to convene in special session at another appointed time, not waiting until their next scheduled session, which is supposed to take place in March. Our efforts now, and here's the last thing. In the moments before Thulani went back to prison, and in the moments where it was quite tense and very low after Judge Ibrahim had said that they would not grant bail that day and they would be going back to court, we convened in an empty courtroom, and we had downloaded the video, this famous video that you haven't seen yet, onto my computer. And I had the opportunity, Jeff and I, to show Thulani the video. It was I'm having goosebumps sort of as I'm telling you this. It was a moving moment and an important one that he didn't say very much about, but I do really truly believe helped to steel his resolve to go back to prison, a place that he's really not crazy about being, as you might expect. But he knows that the world community is supporting him. He knows that this institution is supporting him, and he's strengthened by the support that he feels. What's next? We don't know. You should definitely pick up the article by Caroline James, who really wrote an excellent analysis of what went on November 3rd. Behki was awarded the CNN Multi-Choice Press Freedom Award just prior to the hearing on November 3rd, which also helps to raise his profile and stature in the international community. Over the coming weeks, we will be doing more to raise the profile of this case, and we hope that you will help join to plant these seeds, as Jeff so eloquently said. We want to play the video, and we want to have some time for questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So if you can indulge 3 minutes and 11 seconds for the video, I think we've got it fixed. Is that okay, everybody? All right. Of course, we now have to find where they set it up.
It's just to play it
On the
internet. Not
there you go.
charged of my defense that I'm not in contempt of court.
But that the people of Swaziland are treated with contempt.
I'm just asking this for that. The people of Swaziland have the right to determine and shape their destiny. If truth be told,
This trial is about the prosecution
and persecution of the aspirations of the people of this land
to determine their own destiny democratically and freely.
When freedom is taken away, it becomes the onerous and supreme duty
of man to reclaim it from the oppressor.
For giving up freedom is tantamount to giving away man's right to dignity.
One cannot move today without his or her freedom.
Without that freedom, we are a people without a soul.
I am willing to pay the severest penalty, even if it means spending more days or even more years in jail.
It is well with my soul.
I accept the penalty with a clean and clear conscience that I did no wrong. Human rights
are inherent,
inalienable,
indivisible, and inviolable.
This is clearly
not the case.
It is our respectful contention
that the issue here is not
and has never been contempt of court.
The issue is the abuse of the courts,
silence,
descending voices
In order to suppress aspirations for democratic change,
the people are yearning for freedom.
democracy,
and justice
suppressing ideas
never succeeds in making them go away.
Even if brutal force
Arrest and other forms of
suppression,
are used to silence dissent
History shows
that penalties do not deter men and women
when their conscience
is aroused.
the path to freedom goes through prison. The triumph of justice over evil
is inevitable.
nothing this court can do
Will shake me from my commitment
To simple truth.
Simple justice.
justice.
So with that, I also just want to give a great shout out to Lauren Bartlett, who's been an integral part of this team and who has been really key to many of the main components of this campaign. So while she's not sitting here at the table with us, she's sitting here at the table with us. We have a few minutes. We have a few minutes for questions. Sorry, Ms. Moderator. You should say we have a few minutes for questions.
We have a few minutes for questions.
I was in Swaziland in like 2008, and from what I remember, it was such a small country. It's really easy to get around from one end to the other. With that said, what is the local population like? What are their reactions to the case? Are they aware of what's going on? Like, are people talking about it?
Yeah. In Swaziland, you have to be very careful what you say and who you say it and how you say it. So you won't have too many people speaking out in public. But you go to the bars, you go to the shebeens, you go to the local homesteads, and you start to, if you quietly listen, you'll find out how dissatisfied they are, not just with this case, but with the things in general. Even if you were there, I arrived just before you did then in 2007. And in the time there, with the king becoming more overweening, more greedy, more militaristic, the people are saying, this isn't our culture anymore. And if you talk quietly to them and listen quietly, you'll hear that they are starting to be more critical. There's an article in the Mail and Guardian by Louise Redvers. She did a series of articles in Swaziland, and she was able to go out into the rural areas at the time of the big economic crisis. And people were openly starting to criticise the king, which would never have happened before. In this case, people, what I said earlier about, the idea in the rural communities of not really having a right to have a right, they're at that level of political naivety in some way, but they still have a good sense of justice and what's wrong. And so they are quietly, there's a quiet simmering, and I'm afraid this is where I'm going to be critical of the people that I worked for a long time. The political and civil society leadership are not as skilled as they should be in tapping into that and turning that into a movement or into mobilising that. But people do talk about it and they are very clearly annoyed, but they still don't have the courage to speak out clearly.
What are my biggest concerns what happens in the future? What are the biggest concerns is having a power market in Swaziland, having a free for all, because all we've known, I'm from Swaziland, all we've known is the king. And I've looked at alternatives and I just don't see looking at the opposition, my mom is one of them. We don't seem to have a sense of direction. We don't have a sense of discipline. Like I look at the family, we are very undisciplined. So my question is, what do you think? What's the best?
Do you know what? I believe strongly that you can govern by providing basic human rights for people. That people can be fed who need to be fed. 75% of the population of Swaziland doesn't have food security. You can feed the people. You can provide adequate health care for them. You cannot evict them from their land when you are displeased by their behavior. You can provide them with an outlet to speak. And in some ways, that provides more stability in a country than a heavy-handed ruler does. In terms of what's the alternative, I deeply believe that the alternative is to provide basic rights to people to make them live a happy life. The king may stay in power, and the king may rightfully stay in power as a benevolent ruler who cares for the needs of his people and supports the basic human rights of people, that allows for political pluralism, that allows for these basic human rights. The political solutions inside the country will be something that need to emerge from the Swazi people. It's not something that anybody outside can or should be dictating. But in terms of the basic human rights of the people, I was struck by a beautiful country with deeply caring people, and people who I believe in the work of human rights only want to live in peace and well-being. And that's within the reach of the government of Swaziland to enable. And if they do that, maybe things change.
And just really quickly, I think one of the other important things that we should stress is that no one up here is calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. No one that we met with in Swaziland is calling for the overthrow of the monarchy. The people there are still very deeply, deeply respectful of the monarchy as an institution. But when you talk to people, the overwhelming feeling is that he's gone too far, much farther than his father went, and that it's at a tipping point. And I think, and this is a discussion going to your question specifically, Monty, that Stephen and I have had quite a bit. Is I've been to a lot of countries, including in sub-Saharan Africa, where. But I've never been to a country like Swaziland where civic leaders speak so eloquently and so well. They have a plan, they have a vision, but they don't have the wherewithal to get there yet. There's a lot of Mandelas, but there's not a lot of people who to stuff envelopes, to do the backbreaking work, to do the grassroots work. I was joking that, and Arthur, I see you in the audience, you may understand, is that Swaziland needs a Women of Zimbabwe Arise. They need a nationwide grassroots organization that works in the communities, that works in the rural areas, that educates, as Stephen was saying, educates people on the right to have a right. It's just that part is missing. You have a lot of great people, a lot of wonderfully committed people who speak a really great game and have this fantastic strategic vision, but just not the steps to get to that point there.
It was the work that I was doing for 6 years. We started off doing civic education where we told people about their rights and expected them, well, that's the job done. Not even close. We then started to work with people to say, well, you can go and claim your rights. And we were in this mode of teaching. And that didn't work either. And the only way we started to get people properly engaged and mobilised is when we shut up. And when we listened to the people and allowed them to figure out their own problems and link their problems to governance and link their problems to rights. And in doing that, we were able to hold massive public meetings under the nose of the police. Because Swaziland logo is it's basically a people's parliament with 3,000 people there. But it's a very difficult thing to do and to join up the different areas. But this campaign in Swazi Justice is not so much for governance, it's not so much for the change of any sort of regime. It is for the respect for human rights. Because no matter what regime comes in, no matter what changes, the rights of the people still remain as sacrosanct. So we obviously, you can't do one without the other, but we're very careful that this is focusing on the two basics are the freedom of the press and the independence of the judiciary. And the bigger governance issues, we'll leave that for Swazis to sort out by themselves, but they need international support for this bit alone, and that's what we're here to do.
Any other questions, or that's a pretty good...
So I have kind of a specific question. I'm coming from a context as an American, as a U.S. citizen, and I'm thinking about how obviously the difference in history between, say, Indian reservations in the United States is different from Swaziland and its relationship with South Africa. But does South Africa have some degree of control over the Swazi political machine? And if so, is that mostly in the terms of aid, or is there some kind of bureau, or how does that work? And can you use the South African political system to control outcomes in Swaziland?
Jeff, this is yours.
Jeff, this one's yours.
Absolutely. I won't go too much into the specifics, and I think, Stephen, you can certainly go into this as well, but South Africa is the elephant in the room. They have a huge role to play here in terms of pushing the country more towards respect for democratic norms and international standards, and they're not doing it. I think the decision makers within the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa, see Swaziland as a relatively stable, peaceful, backyard issue, and they don't want to mess with it. But that's one of the problems that I see here, and I think the U.S. has to take some responsibility for that too. We've done a horrible job, and when I say we, I mean the U.S. government has done a horrible job in pushing and prodding these regional leaders like South Africa to play a more proactive role at the regional level. We should be working with countries like South Africa that are ostensibly meant to be, or supposed to be, the democratic standard bearers, not only for the region, but arguably for the entire continent. We should be working with countries and leaders there, with countries and leaders in countries like Senegal and Ghana that are relatively well-performing countries, but that aren't really promoting a human rights oriented foreign policy. And that's one of the problems with South Africa. And if you look at the history between South Africa and Swaziland, essentially throughout this entire financial crisis that Swaziland is experiencing, it's South Africa that's holding them up through the South African Customs Union. I think they get about 60% of their budget from the regional customs union, and South Africa controls that. But they haven't been able to go that far and pull the trigger and really force reforms that are desperately needed.
And just to add in a more personal and spiritual dimension to this, before President Zuma was elected in 2009, he arrived in Swaziland and the traditional healers prayed over him and performed their rites. In the ANC international section of their manifesto, they mentioned 5 countries in Africa that they would engage with: Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Sudan, DRC, Western Sahara. In President Zuma's acceptance speech and his inauguration speech, he read out the 5 and left out Swaziland both times. He's very closely aligned, both personally, spiritually, culturally, with the Swazi government. And while Zuma's there, as well as everything else, and financially, but they are very. So there's a personal element to this, as well as the higher level legal stuff and the higher level political stuff. And I think your analogy with the reservations is very interesting. I'd like to explore that a wee bit further, but not now.
Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Thank you to my colleagues who have done amazing work. And if we can just ask you one more thing, implore you to like us on Facebook, share the video, tweet as much as possible, and take the urgent action in the petition. It really does make a difference, and it only takes a couple minutes. Thank you so much.